Hello and welcome back to the third part in a three-part series on an introduction to Web3 for educators. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Mike Peck. Thanks for joining me for today's final installment of this webinar series. Just a little bit about me. I am a director of technology in a public school district in Pennsylvania. I'm also co-founder of Ed3 DAO, which is a nonprofit community of educators that's focused on onboarding educators into Web3. You can check us out on Twitter at Ed3DAO. You can also find us on LinkedIn on the same name. If you wish to connect with me directly, you can find my profile or my account at EdTechPack on Twitter, and you can also find me on LinkedIn as well. So let's jump into the third part in this series. Today we're going to look at the road ahead. So Web3 is a really new set of technologies and principles, and it's very emergent. The use cases are fairly limited, and most of the world is really still trying to figure out how this technology will change the future of the web and really the future of our lives. And while it's not totally clear yet, there are some things that we can see. We talked about the trends in the last particular part of the webinar series. Today we're going to look at the here and the now. We're going to look at the current state of Web3. What are those things that are barriers to adoption or challenges in the road? We're going to talk about how this is implemented in schools. What are the ethics, the equity, and accessibility conversations that need to be had in schools as this technology becomes more prevalent? Last but not least, we're going to talk about the future of Web3 and how you can stay kind of in tune with what's happening in the ecosystem. So with that, let's jump in. So to quickly recap from our last episode in this webinar series, we want to talk about the big trends that are reshaping education. We talked about the creator economy, the unbundling of learning and remote work and metaverse spaces. When we talk about the creator economy, we're talking about the ability of people to, or individuals rather, to create, distribute, and also monetize their own content and services without intermediaries. So we're really talking about a shift in the way that the web is designed. Second, we talked about unbundling learning, which is we're really breaking down the silos of the subjects and skill areas that we see in traditional education to being more personalized and inclusive of all the learning experiences that one has. These new technologies are allowing us to sort of piece together our learning in new ways. Last but not least, the remote work and metaverse. We're talking about a shift towards digital-first learning experiences, whether it's in the workplace or in a classroom. These new technologies are becoming more and more accessible and better in terms of the quality, and will provide us new ways of thinking about how we focus on teaching and learning. So when we talk about the current state of Web3, there's a number of hurdles that need to be addressed. And on the left-hand side, I run through a few of them. Web3 growth is moving very, very quickly. So there's all sorts of technologies that are being iterated on and built on, and the space moves very, very fast. Kind of the joke is that, like, if you miss a day in Web3, you're missing like a week or a month. Things happen very, very quickly. And as a result of that speed, there's a really steep learning curve for both adults and young people alike. The space is very volatile. There's a lot of different things that you probably have seen in the news where people have been scammed or taken advantage of because they didn't quite understand what they were doing in the space. And so it's really, really important to understand that it's very complicated to use a lot of these technologies right now. In time, we would expect that a lot of these complexities can be abstracted away. If you think about the ability to make your own website, it used to be very, very difficult and complicated 5, 10, 15 years ago. Today you can build a website in minutes, in some cases using AI tools. And so when we think about this technology, there's a likelihood that the complexity will in time be sort of abstracted away. But for now, it's very difficult to use. Other things that might get in the way of this the adoption of Web3 in schools is that they may lack the resources to implement. Whether we're talking about the physical technology or the know-how to implement these things. There's definitely some things that need to be considered in terms of like the resources required to implement this technology. There's also a lot of need for clarity around regulations. In the US in particular, there isn't much clarity around some of these technologies, including things like cryptocurrencies. We're seeking more regulatory clarity, and that will help us, understand how these tools will be governed. But there's other, regulations, policies, rules, and guidelines that must be followed, in terms of student data and things like that, which are also things that need to be addressed. So we know that broadly, there's definitely some barriers or hurdles to adoption in schools. But as the technology becomes more accessible, there are some areas that we want to think about in terms of how this technology is implemented into our schools and our classrooms. And so I titled this section the Ethics, Equity, and Access section. So the first thing I want to start with is, what are the ethical considerations? It's really important that when we introduce technology into a school setting, that we're considering the ethical the implications before we actually implement something. In particular, when we're talking about technology here, data ownership is really a big question. So who owns the data? Now, when you interact with these platforms on your own, that data is yours. If you have something in your wallet, that wallet is yours. Will students have their own digital wallets? Possibly. But we need to consider who owns those wallets. What are the students' ownership responsibilities when they have access to this technology? We also need to consider what happens when students or learners might misuse the technology in the classroom. It's already a challenge today, but it's something that we need to think more deeply about as we start to introduce these new technologies. Last but not least, we got to consider the current narrative around Web3. Most people who have heard of Web3 or heard of things like cryptocurrencies or NFTs, think about like the massive bubble in value, or possibly they think about scams and scam artists and things of that nature. We need to be very thoughtful about how we educate our school communities before bringing these technologies into our classrooms. Now, at this point in time, things are very new, they're very novel, very emergent. But in time, we will probably see a lot of these technologies become part of our everyday life. Until that time, though, we need to be considering how do we educate our communities around, what Web3 is and how it can empower our learners. So I lumped together equity and accessibility here, and the first part I talked about is closing the digital divide. The digital divide, we know in a couple of different contexts, and most of the time we think about making sure that learners have the right technology in their hands, that every learner has their own computer. And that is important for sure. Having the technology and the hardware is critical. But we've reached a point where most learners have a device. Many have multiple devices and some on their own. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about is not just the hardware divide, but do we have a divide in terms of their access to knowledge? How are our teachers being prepared with the knowledge they need to, enhance their instruction or give learners the skills they need to, be an engaging member in a society where Web3 or these new technologies become commonplace? So we need to be making sure that our educators are prepared for these shifts in the web as they do come. And as we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years, the web has evolved dramatically and is used now in our everyday lives. How are we preparing our educators, to teach young people about these technologies in the context of teaching and learning? Access across school demographics, as we've seen in the past, some of the key skills like the digital literacy skills, some of these are sort of embedded within classrooms, say in like the computers or the computer science realm. and they aren't necessarily embedded within our curriculum. One of the things that will be really, really important is that as the world continues to globalize and this technology connects us, across the web at any time, any place, we need to ensure that all learners have access to the digital literacies that are necessary for engaging in this new paradigm of Web3, not just those students who are engaging in classes or taking classes in the area of, say, computer sciences. And last but not least, accessibility. Are these tools accessible to all of our learners, even those with special needs? So how do we consider, getting them the skills that they might need in a world where digital payments are run through, say, digital currencies, or you purchase tickets as NFTs? How are we giving them the skills to engage in the same platforms, and how are we scaffolding for those learners to engage in these new technologies? So the last one I have is data privacy, and as a director of technology, this is an area in particular that I've seen a lot of shift in, even in the last 5 years. There are current data policies and rules depending on what country you're in. In particular, here in the U.S., we're looking at things like FERPA and COPA. These are important federal rules that are in place to protect our learners and their data. How do those laws affect our ability to implement Web3 technologies in our classrooms? Another key area is authorized consent. For those of you who are Google users, you know that a lot of applications are now, you now have to approve access for applications to have learners sign in with Google to that platform. That's because of authorized consent. They're ensuring that if a student is using a platform, that we have the permission of the parents for that student to use the platform. How does that play a part when we're talking about Web3 technologies? It's the same as our access to the Web2 platforms we use, or is it something different? What data goes on chain? So you can put just about any type of data on blockchain, but we really be really thoughtful about what type of data goes on chain, because once it's there permanently. And so we don't want to be adding personal information to a blockchain. Thinking about what data goes on chain is going to be a really important decision for schools to make, builders to make, as we move into this new era of Web3. And then last but not least is how do we teach learners about data ownership? There's already conversations about digital footprints and preparing learners for, making sure they understand, if you post this on social media, it goes out into the world. How do we double down on those efforts and really help them understand that their data is really important to understand how their data can be used or managed under their control? So Web3 and the future of education. So the one thing that I would add here is that the hype around Web3 has definitely gone away quite a bit. However, if we look closely, there are a lot of signs that the technology, while the hype has disappeared, the technology is just really getting started. From Pearson Publishing, their books as NFTs, to MasterCard, Visa, Venmo, all building some of their infrastructure for managing accounts on blockchain, to Starbucks, as I mentioned before, their Odyssey program, and other organizations like Apple and Meta building platforms for AR and VR. There is plenty of building going on in the Web3 space, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down, even though the hype has gone. These new technologies are going to continue to grow and going to continue to make their way into our everyday lives, albeit in a less complex way than the early stages of Web3. So as the web evolves and these new technologies make their way into our everyday lives, it's important that our learners understand what these technologies are and how they can be used. Some of the areas in particular where we will see Web3 technologies in education, as I mentioned, we already have seen it in areas like credentialing. We're already seeing it in metaverse spaces, where we have platforms like Roblox and Minecraft and others that are soon to follow. Last but not least, we will see the emergence of decentralized learning platforms. As I mentioned before, learning is already really decentralized. You can go onto the web and learn just about anything in some kind of skills class or master class, without having to go to a university or a school. We're going to continue to see those platforms grow, and begin to decentralize and really begin to focus on accruing value back to the individuals who are teaching those courses. And so that those trends have already begun. That ship has already set sailed. How does it continue to impact the future of teaching and learning? That's what we need to continue to focus on and watch. So how do you stay informed in a world where everything is moving rather quickly? There's a few different ways that I suggest here. One is by checking out communities that are exploring this space and that are involved in the space. As I mentioned, Ed3DAO is one of those communities. Also, Web3 Academy is another great community to check out. Both have platforms on Twitter, and so you can find them at those names. Social media resources. I listed a few different individuals who I follow pretty closely and I would say are more trusted voices in the space. One in particular I'm a fan of is Josh Rosenthal. He is a PhD historian who focused his work on the Renaissance, but talks a lot about how Web3 is sort of our modern day Renaissance. And so he has some wonderful takes on the space, both on podcasts that he's done, as well as on Twitter. Chris Dixon has written a few books on Web3 and how this technology can impact the future of work. And so it's another great resource to check out. Gary Vaynerchuk is the last one I listed. He made his main mark in marketing back in the Web2 days, but has moved his operations into the Web3 world, building out different projects and collections in the space. Certainly last but not least, we have some news sources. I listed Cointelegraph is a news source that I check out regularly, as well as Decrypt, which has everything about Web3 and AI, as well as other innovative learning technologies. And so you can check them out at decrypt.co. And so that takes us to the end of our three-part series here on an introduction to Web3 for educators. As I mentioned at the end of the previous webinars, you can continue your learning with us at Ed3DAO. So if you'd like to learn more, you can check out our website, www.ed3dao.com, where you can find a little bit about our community, our events, some of the work we've done previously. You can also follow us on social media at Ed3DAO on LinkedIn and Twitter. Once again, thanks so much for joining me on this journey through Web3. I hope that through this webinar series that you found the foothold to begin your further exploration of the space and are feeling more prepared for the future of the web in teaching and learning. Thanks for joining me.